to be talking a little bit about my background and a little bit of yoga philosophy and about vinyasa and how it works, and a few practice tips and guidelines. So first of all, I started practicing yoga when I was 12 years old, living in India, and it was not vinyasa yoga. It was what I would call classical hatha yoga. And it wasn't until much later, when I was in my 20s, that I encountered Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga and started studying Ashtanga with Richard Freeman in Boulder, Colorado. So the thing that distinguishes the Ashtanga Vinyasa system from almost every other kind of modern yoga discipline that's been passed from Indian traditional practices into the modern world is that Ashtanga is a set sequence, and it's very vigorous right from the start, with jumping sun salutes and a very comprehensive flow of standing poses and sitting poses, and they do what's called vinyasa in between all the sitting poses. The vinyasa, which is defined as doing a chaturanga, which is like a low plank, upward dog, downward dog, continuously throughout the practice. So you really do get a pretty strong workout. And it has a comprehensive framework, starting from the sun salutes to inversions at the end. So the only thing comparable is that in the modern world, there's been the development of a more free way of approaching vinyasa yoga, which was derived from the teachings. I'll give you a little background. The teachings of Krishnamacharya, who is thought to be the great grandfather or the father of vinyasa. He based his teachings of vinyasa on a scripture that has the whole story of how he found the scripture is a little bit obscured in mystery, but it's called the Yoga Kurunta, and it prescribed a particular way of practicing, which is what I was just describing, where it's a vigorous form. And the way that he interpreted it in the early days was more as a more creative, like the teacher has license to change things up in certain ways. And there's a book that he wrote called the Yoga Makaranda, which shows this pattern. And then when he taught his student Pattabhi Jois created this set sequence. And so what we're seeing today is this shift back to the more open frame, open, flexible way, excuse the pun, of doing this more vigorous form of yoga that we now call vinyasa. Now, there are other terms that have been used in modern yoga. They call it power yoga or flow yoga. And it's in the creative forms can have a lot of possible variation. It can be done much slower and easier. It can be done even harder and sometimes even faster. But generally speaking, I'm going to make a few comments now about how we want to approach our vinyasa. And really, it comes down to a certain philosophical perspective. Yoga philosophy really, in a way, it's pointing us towards a shift in our awareness and our consciousness. And that in the Yoga Sutras, it talks about 8 limbs of yoga. They are yama, living an ethical life, living according to certain ethical principles. Niyama, certain daily observances like cleanliness and a good diet. Asana, which is primarily what we focus on in a vinyasa yoga practice. And pranayama, which is breath and energy awareness and exercises. And pratyahara, turning awareness inward. Dharana, which is concentration. Dhyana, which is meditation and samadhi, which is enlightened states. So it really shows you how, in a way, the practices in Vinyasa Yoga are within the category of Hatha Yoga, meaning postural practices. And Hatha Yoga is not necessarily just an exercise system, even though many people interpret it that way. It's definitely exercise, but it's not purely exercise in the sense of just physical fitness. It has an intention that goes beyond physical fitness, which is really to prepare you. It's right there in the path, as I was just describing it, of yoga and the philosophy of yoga, is asana and pranayama are there as tools and techniques to help you to go towards the deeper practices or the inner practices. And so this is where vinyasa and the way that we approach it can sometimes be misunderstood. And it's not just like what sometimes the power yoga aspect. If you approach it that way, then it can actually sometimes be too much. And so it's, in a certain sense, for people who are after physical fitness, it may not be enough. And for those who approach their yoga as a dynamic, intense workout, it might be too much. So it's really about finding the balance. So it's taking into consideration your condition, your age, all these different aspects, which I write about in the book, right? And it's also important to consider long-term how you're practicing. If you're doing the same intense thing every day, that's probably not the best idea. It's good to change things, even though it's being consistent is really important. Making sure you cover all these different categories of poses, and making sure you really warm up, but keeping your own condition in mind in how is essential. And so if you have injuries or anything that you need to be aware of, you might even tailor your practice around that, or you might avoid certain things. So the idea is to have a progression that makes sense. Yes, there's flow, it's dynamic, and it's incorporating breathing, but always do it in such a way that it makes sense for you. And for longevity, for a long-term practice, you definitely want to take into account all the ebbs and flows of your life, and how at times a practice needs to be softer, at times you can make it a little harder. And that's the beauty of a creative vinyasa program. So welcome to the program. See you in the next video.